Welcome to CEC. I am Meeta Mathur. Samuel Taylor Coleridge. In continuation to my previous lecture, which was about the shift of British writing from neoclassicism to romantics, with special reference to William Wordsworth, who was also known as the father of English romanticism, I would now move on to another literary giant, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Wordsworth and Coleridge, both of them were great friends. They both loved nature and were staunch believers of freedom of self-expression. He was most intimate friend of Wordsworth, and the influence on one another was most productive. In Coleridge, we find the rare combination of the dreamer and a profound scholar. Coleridge is remembered not only as a great poet but also as a critic and a philosopher. He lived in a period where science, religion and politics, all these things were at variance. He wrote a great philosophical work which is called as The Aids of Reflection, and it is one of his most profound philosophical work. It had a wide popularity in the 19th century. Aids to Reflection is the result of the amalgamation of the author's personal transcendental philosophy with more traditional Protestant doctrine. Coleridge begins his treatise by explaining that his intention is didactic in nature. He hopes that his readers will be largely young intellectuals who are aspiring to greater reflective spiritual discipline, particularly those entering a clerical life. He sets forth various objectives in his preface to acknowledge the value of words. Aids of Reflections is written primarily in aphoristic style, which means the aphorisms are categorized according to prudence, morality or spirituality. This means a compact and condensed style of writing. This stresses the importance of thinking, particularly reflective thinking, considering its end, self-knowledge, to be the individual. It is reflected in the Aids of Reflection. A deep sense of isolation and the effort to use learning and eloquence to overcome it remained with Coleridge throughout his life. He was all alone. He suffered loneliness. He suffered from depression. He entered Cambridge in 1791, but he could never complete his work and for his university degree. Depressed by the debts, he fled the university in December 1793. Rescued by his brothers, he returned to the Cambridge University in April and resumed his studies. Coleridge's health had always been very poor, and he had become addicted to opium, which, according to standard medical practice at that time, he had originally taken opium to relieve himself of the pain. He also resumed his public lectures on philosophy and literature, and in time became a London celebrity, enthralling visitors with his conversation and gradually attracting a circle of disciples. In this work, he attempted to distinguish between understanding, which gives us a known of the ordinary world, and a reason which guides us towards the ultimate spiritual truths. Besides these considerable contributions to criticism and philosophy, his contributions in poetry are most memorable and remarkable. His notable poetic works are The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Kubla Khan, The Christabel and The Dejection Ode. Within Coleridge, there was a strange territory of memory and dream, of strange birds, phantom ships, Arctic seas, caverns, the sounds of unearthly instruments and haunted figures. He could visualize, he could sense all these things. He imagined a world beyond the control of reason in which the magic reigned. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is Coleridge's chief contribution to the Lyrical Ballads. As I told you in my previous lecture, that the Lyrical Ballads is a collection of poems by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. This collection was first published in 1798. This is also considered to have marked the beginning of the English Romantic movement. It became a landmark which changed the course of English literature and poetry completely. Both the poets, Wordsworth and Coleridge, they set out to overturn what they thought was priggish and learned. They were a class apart from what was the existing norm during neoclassicism. They also thought to do away with the highly sculpted forms of 18th century English poetry and to make it accessible to the average reader. They believed in composing the verse in common everyday language. These two major poets, Wordsworth and Coleridge, laid emphasis on the need of the living voice for the common man to express reality. Their language also helped to assert the universality of human emotions. The title of the collection, Lyrical Ballads, is suggestive of the recalling of the rustic art. The word lyrical links the poems with the ancient rustic bards and lends the poem an air of spontaneity. This part was taken care of by William Wordsworth. The ballads are an oral mode of storytelling used by common man through times immemorial. This part was taken care of by Coleridge. Coleridge also resumed his public lectures on philosophy and literature and in time became a London celebrity, enthralling visitors with the conversation and gradually attracting a circle of disciples. The majority of the poems written by Coleridge were considered to be the experiments. They were written chiefly with a view to ascertain that how far the language of conversation in the middle and lower classes of society is adapted to the purpose of poetic pleasure. I would like to remind you here that the middle and the lower classes, they came up with the advent of Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. This shift of focus on the simple and uneducated country people was a signal leading to modern literature. One of the major themes of lyrical ballads is the return to the original state of nature. In this state, people led a purer and more innocent existence. They both subscribed to Rousseau's belief that humanity was essentially good but was corrupted by the influence of society. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is Coleridge's chief contribution to the Lyrical Ballads. This poem was first published in 1798. It is possibly one of Wordsworth's masterpieces. When we go through the poem, it introduces us to a supernatural realm with a phantom ship, a crew of dead men, the overhanging curse of the albatross, the polar spirit, and the magic breeze. Though it presents a supernatural world before us, it nevertheless manages to create a sense of absolute reality concerning these manifest absurdities. All the mechanisms of the poem, such as its meter, rhyme, and melody, are perfect. Some of its descriptions of the lonely sea have never been equaled to any others. In this poem, Coleridge attached a lesson at the end of the narrative where all moves in weird and unexpected sequence. the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, recounts the experiences of a sailor who has returned from a long sea voyage. The mariner stops a man who is on his way to a wedding ceremony and begins to narrate a story. In the beginning, the wedding guest's reaction turns from bemusement to impatience and to fear to fascination as the mariner's story progresses. The expressions of the guest are quite noteworthy. Coleridge uses narrative techniques such as personification and repetition to create a sense of danger, the supernatural, or serenity depending on the mood in different part of his poem. See, this is the wreck of the ship in which the mariner was travelling. The poem begins with an old grey-bearded sailor, the mariner, stopping a guest at a wedding ceremony to tell him a story of a sailing voyage he took long ago. The wedding guest is at first reluctant to listen as the ceremony is about to begin, but the mariner's glittering eye captivates him. The mariner's tale begins with his ship departing on its journey. Despite initial good fortune, the ship is driven south by a storm and eventually reaches the icy waters of the Antarctica. An albatross appears and leads the ship out of the ice jam where it is stuck. But even as the albatross is fed and praised by the ship's crew, the mariner shoots the bird. With my crossbow, I shot the albatross. He gives no reason why he shot the bird. The crew is angry with the mariner, believing that the albatross brought the south wind and led them out of the Antarctica and led them out of danger. However, the sailors change their minds when the weather becomes warmer and the mist disappears. It was right, said they, such birds to slay that brings the fog and mist. But immediately after saying this, they soon find that they made a grave mistake in supporting this crime, as it arouses the wrath of spirits who then pursue the ship from the land of mist and snow. The south wind that had initially blown them north now sends the ship into uncharted waters. Day after day, we stuck, nor breath nor motion, as idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. Then Coleridge goes on to say, water, water everywhere, and all the boards did shrink. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. Ominous sign. The sailors, they change their minds again and start blaming the mariner for the torment of their thirst. In anger, the crew forces the mariner to wear the dead albatross about his neck, perhaps to illustrate the burden he must suffer from killing it, or perhaps as a sign of regret. Ah, well a day! What evil looks had I from old and young! Instead of the cross, the albatross about my neck was hung. After a weary time, the ship encounters a ghostly hulk. On board are death and the nightmare life in death. There is a deathly pale woman who is playing dice for the souls of the crew. With the roll of the dice, death wins the lives of the crew members, and the life in death, the life of the mariner, a prize she considers more valuable. Her name is a clue to the mariner's fate. He will endure a fate worse than death as punishment for his killing of the albatross. This is what all the crew members feel. One of all the crew members die. The mariner lives on. seeing for 7 days and nights the curse in the eyes of the crew corpses, whose last expression remain upon their faces. 4 times 50 living men. See, 4 times 50 means 200. I heard nor sigh nor groan. With heavy thump, a lifeless lump, they dropped down one by one. The souls did from their bodies fly. They fled to bliss or woe, and every soul it passed me by like the whiz of my crossbow. He could sense that each dead body, each soul was signaling something to him. Eventually, this stage of the mariner's curse is lifted, and he begins to appreciate the many sea creatures swimming in the water. Despite his cursing them as slimming things earlier in the poem, he suddenly sees their true beauty and blesses them. A spring of love gushed from my heart, and I blessed them unaware. As he manages to pray, the albatross falls from his neck, and his guilt is partially expiated. He is free from the guilt, he is free from the curse, and it then starts to rain, and the bodies of the crew, possessed by good spirits, rise again and help steer the ship. In a trance, the mariner hears 2 spirits discussing his voyage and penance, and learns that the ship is being powered supernaturally, or rather empowered supernaturally. Finally, the mariner wakes from the trance and comes in sight of his homeland, but is initially uncertain as to whether or not he is hallucinating. He is not ready to believe that he has reached his homeland. Oh, dream of joy! Is this indeed the lighthouse top I see? Is this the hill? Is this the kirk? Is this mine own country? He is actually not ready to believe that he has reached his own country. The rotten remains of the ship sink in a whirlpool, leaving only the mariner behind. A hermit on the mainland, who has spotted the approaching ship, comes to meet it in a boat rowed by a pilot and his boy. When they pull the mariner from the water, they think he is dead, but when he opens his mouth, the pilot shrieks with fright. He is not dead. The hermit prays, and the mariner picks up the oars to row. He is fine. The pilot's boy laughs, thinking the mariner is the devil, and cries, "The devil knows how to row." Back on land, the mariner is completely by a woeful agony to tell the hermit his story. As penance for shooting the albatross, the mariner, driven by the agony of his guilt, is now forced to wander the earth, telling his story over and over and teaching a lesson to those he meets. He prayeth best who loveth best all things, both great and small, for the dear God who loveth all, he made us and loved all. After finishing his story, the mariner leaves, and the wedding guest returns home, waking the next morning a sadder and a wiser man. Coleridge made several modifications to the poem over the years. In the second edition of the Lyrical Ballads, published in 1800, he replaced many of the archaic words. The Romantic poets laid great stress on the diction. It had to be the language of common men. He changed them because they did not go well with the theory of common language. Now the question is, where did he derive this inspiration of writing the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner? There are various sources. He derived the inspiration of writing the poem from various sources. They may have been inspired by James Cook's second voyage of exploration of the South Seas and the Pacific Ocean. Coleridge's tutor, William Wales, was an astronomer on Cook's flagship and had a strong relationship with Cook. On the second voyage, Cook crossed 3 times into the Antarctic Circle to determine whether the fabled great southern continent Terra Australia existed. According to William Wordsworth, the poem was inspired while Coleridge Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy were on a walking tour through the Quantock Hills in Somerset. The discussion then at that time had turned to a book that Wordsworth was reading. The name of that book was A Voyage Round the World by Way of the Great South Sea, which was written by Captain George Shavlock. The book told of a privateering voyage in 1719, during which a melancholy sailor, Simon Hetley, shot a black albatross. The poem may also have been inspired by the legends of the wandering Jew who was forced to wander the earth until the judgment day for a terrible crime found in Charles Mutrin and M.G. Lewis, and the legend of the Flying Dutchman. In his own philosophical work called Biographia Literaria, Coleridge wrote, "The thought suggested to which both of us, Wordsworth and Coleridge himself, that a series of poems might be composed of 2 sorts. In the words of Coleridge himself, he says, I quote, "In the one, incidents and agents were to be, in part at least, supernatural, and the excellence aimed at was to consist in interesting of the affections by the dramatic truth of such emotions as would naturally accompany such situations, supposing them real, and real in the sense that they have been to every human being who from whatever source of delusion has at any time believed himself under supernatural agency," means that they would write of the incidents that every person would be able to relate to. For the second class, these are his own words, I would again quote, "Subjects were to be chosen from ordinary life." In his own, this idea originated the plan of the Lyrical Ballads. There it was agreed that the endeavours of Coleridge should be directed to persons and characters supernatural, or at least romantic, yet so as to transfer from our inward nature a human interest and a semblance of truth, sufficient to procure for these shadows of imagination that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment which constitutes poetic faith. With this view, he wrote the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. On a surface level, the poem explores a violation of nature and the resulting of psychological effects on the mariner and on all those who hear his story. The poem's structure is multi-layered, text-based on Coleridge's interest. Like the Iliad or Paradise Lost or any great historical poet, the rhyme is a work of trans-historical rather than so-called universal significance. Coleridge, along with Wordsworth, is the pioneer of romantic poetry. Poetry of reason had limited scope and it could not appeal to the readers for a longer time. As a reader of this poem, one should keep in mind the narrative of the poem, the setting both internal, external, which are quite noteworthy. What was the sin that was committed by the mariner and how was he punished? Points to be pondered on. The portrayal of nature before and after the shooting of the albatross is different, and we ought to notice the difference. While we read Coleridge, we as readers should be able to differentiate between fancy and imagination. The reader must understand how the supernatural element is involved in his poetry. Coleridge maintained that usage of loose rhyme scheme and archaic language in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and was deliberate and scholarly, was intended to provoke thought about the use of such devices and invoke a sort of literary timelessness. I would like to end my endless discussion on the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner here. We shall take up the other poems by Coleridge in my next session. Thanks.